Thanks, Karishma, and to Creative Mornings for that, I think, warm introduction and for the invitation to participate or to be a part of this talk as well. And I was thinking of, again, as Karishma said, there's so many thematics, and how do we get all these thematics together is going to be quite challenging. But I thought we can begin with even Creative Mornings and what is the imperative that you have? Why do you do these kind of talks? Why do you do these kinds of discussions? What is the value of this? And how does that, in a sense, link to what my friend Vinay put up there, which is the Constitution of India, and the ideals in the Constitution itself? The Constitution talks about one thing: liberty, equality, and fraternity. Liberty and equality, in some senses, we all know, but fraternity is a lesser known dimension of what it is that makes us human. And fraternity, I think, is an important segue or way to think really about both what the trust does, what Creative Mornings does, and what value fraternity can bring to a whole range of conversations, as it were. And in my mind, when we think about it, about why Creative Mornings is doing these talks, or why RBANM has a trust, or why the Alternative Law Forum, the other organization I'm a part of exists. It's really to do, I think, again, getting back to a very, very fundamental point. And in fact, I was just chatting with people around and asked them, why are you here? And everybody seemed to, not everybody, again, a couple of people indicated that they're the first time here. And there is a sense of a desire to connect. There's a sense of you want to call it a sense of a loneliness, sense of an isolation which people feel, and they want to be part of something larger, part of a larger group. And I think that's the imperative in Creative Mornings, and that's the imperative which I think has drawn you all together here on this Sunday morning when you could very well be doing something else. And I think the idea, again, since we're trying to think of so many thematics, when we think of these three notions, to me, loneliness, isolation, solitude, go back to Hannah Arendt and her work Origins of Totalitarianism, and she has a really marvelous distinction between these three. And the point she makes on what she calls loneliness, again, that might mirror a lot of the experience of people in some parts of their life, which is, you describe it as fundamental ability or inability to connect with the world. You're in the world, you're with people all around you, but you somehow find it difficult to really connect with people. You're with people, but you can't really connect with anybody, as it were. So that's what she describes as the experience of loneliness. And in her analysis, loneliness is the disease of the 20th century. And I guess we can all agree that loneliness might very well be the disease of the 21st century as well, especially with the social media world that is really around us. So in a sense, when we come together, our first imperative, I think, is really to break that sense of loneliness by being together with other people. It could be a running group. It could be having breakfast together. It could be a range of things which allow you to break the sense of loneliness. But I think the important point is breaking loneliness, end of the day, might be about your own individual sense of well-being, which is important. But I think there's something more to us as human beings. And I think Arendt gestures to that when she talks about also the idea of isolation. When she says isolation, the idea of isolation is that every totalitarian state aspires to keep us in a state of isolation, which is the idea that you can't change the world. That I am myself in my own separate world, you are yourself in your own separate world. You don't care about the world at large, I don't care about the world at large. So it's best that I go forward and make my own living in my own particular space. So isolation breaks when people start coming together or acting together. I'll give you one example again from another domain, which is again a very important human rights thinker in India called Bal Gopal. And the point he makes is why does the state arrest, for example, at that moment in time, Binayak Sen? It arrests Binayak Sen because it considers him a threat to, within quotes, national security, arrested on the UAPA. But the other point is this: Binayak Sen is raising questions of the state. So the message we're sending out to everybody else is if you question, you will be arrested as well. And so that creates that sense of isolation. So the antidote to isolation is solidarity and community, right? You say that, yes, we can change things by us coming together. At both at the local level, at the national level, larger levels, you can think of something like Bharat Jodo Yatra, a range of examples of people coming together as a way of trying to bring about some kind of transformation or some kind of a change. So I think really the imperative of coming together is both to break loneliness, which is very personal and very important, as well as to challenge the sense of isolation, which is the only way change can really happen. So that's the broad framework which I have of why I think trust is important for human society itself. And perhaps one more dimension I want to add to that, again going back to Arendt, which is a marvelous description of what you mean by life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We often think, and she puts it this way, we often think of the pursuit of happiness as just my desire to do what I want in my own world. I do what I want, you do what you want, we all do what we want. But her point there is happiness doesn't just have a private dimension, it also has a public dimension. You're happy when you're actually doing something in community with others. You're happy when you're actually trying to work to transform or change the world that you live in. So your happiness comes from a sense of collective involvement as well. So there's a really powerful point where our happiness is really about us working to change the world that we live in. With that kind of an introductory frame of thought, let me take you a little bit to the institution we're in now, really. Karishma indicated in the introduction to my great-great-great-granduncle who set up this particular charity called the RBANM charitable institutions. I had a chance to go back to a couple of the historical documents around that time period to figure out what were his motivations when he established this. He was a young man in North Arcot district who came from there to Bangalore, and he was an entrepreneur at heart. And he was initially selling vegetables, then he moved on to selling of salt, then he moved on to selling of furniture, then he moved to working with the British, then he was part of the building of the Attara Kacheri, which is the High Court premises, and he made a lot of money, right? And the interesting thing for me is when he made a lot of money, his imperative was, okay, I must do something for charitable purposes as well. And that was the thinking in his mind. And so what he did, again, so interesting, is that, again, his time span, right? We're thinking of somebody who was born in the early 19th century and passed away in 1910. So it's a long span of time, 1840s or 1830s is when he was born, if I remember. But the important point is he established a school in 1874. And what is 1874, the significance of 1874 in the history of our country, right? You think of it, 1874, when he established the school, was before the Indian National Congress was formed in 1885. Yeah? And so it was the imagination of a school before the idea of independence emerged as far as the formation of the Congress in India itself was concerned. And what did you do at that particular moment in time? Of course, you worked with the British very, very, very closely. And he established the first school in this cantonment area for Indians, or what we call it, of course, at the time, natives. And if you know the schools which many of us studied in, as you can see, many of our former schoolmates here, be it St. Joseph's, or be it St. Andrews, or be it Baldwin's, they were schools which were meant for British. The first school which was established for Indians in the cantonment area was the RBANM in 1870. So again, there's a certain kind of you want to take it back to the Constitution. The idea underlying the establishment of the first school for Indians is really that there should be no discrimination on grounds of race. So he's, in a sense, a precursor, or he's thinking of an idea which becomes very important as Article 15 later on, which is the idea that you don't discriminate against persons on grounds of race. Indians are equally entitled to education as white people, or as the British people at that particular moment in time. That itself, I thought it's important, but I think in my mind, it's not extraordinary. It's not extraordinary to say that you must have a school for Indians, only because you're a rising power at that moment in time. Obviously, if you want your power to increase, you must establish a school. obviously you must get your own people educated. Obviously you must go up and left, and that seems quite logical to me. But I think where he was truly, to my mind, extraordinary is he also established at that time the first school for girls and the first school for Dalits. The first school for girls, again, at the time before, the first school for girls in India was established in the 1840s by Jyotiba Phule. The first school for girls here, called the Govindamal Girls School, which is still there in the Alsur area, was established in the 1870s. So again, it's somebody who thought ahead of his time, literally ahead of his time. And when a time when most girls were at home, were not really educated, he had the imagination to establish the first school for girls. And the third school he established, which I think to my mind was the most extraordinary, he established the first school for Dalits in this area. Again, you go to the archival material at that moment in time, the description of the Dalit theory, right, where the upper caste or the intermediate caste did not go, and it's very clear that the Dalits were not entitled to education within the thinking at that moment in time. So for him, Arvind Narrain to establish the first school for Dalits indicated a very important thing. He was somebody who was not just interested in the political idea of equality with the British, but was also interested in the idea of equality within your own society. And that's a very, very important point. Very important point, because you have to challenge the biases and prejudices within your own society. That's often the most difficult thing, right? It's easy sometimes to challenge prejudices out there. But how do you challenge a prejudice which is part of your family, which is part of your culture, part of your society, part of everybody around you? So how do you get that kind of imagination to challenge the prejudice which says that Dalits are not entitled to education? I thought that's an extraordinary kind of a visionary idea that he established this school in the 1870s. Then the building you see there, which is now Cinnamon, was actually another institution established as an orphanage for people, for kids who were orphans during the Great Famine of the 1870s, right? Again, the imagination say that, there's a problem here. We have to address it. What can we do? What can we do about it? And establishing that first school, that first orphanage as well. So you see this range of institutions established very early on, and I think being as all of us are, I'm sure, part of many institutions. How does an organization or an institution survive for 150 years? And that's the challenging question. And there, I think we have to give credit to the imagination. But the trust, right? The trust deed has a space for family members to be there, which is one part of it. But equally, other eminent citizens in the region or the locality. So the first president of the trust was then Diwan of the Mysore state, right? And so there's the ways in which they managed to get in top level talent in terms of the trust board itself. Currently, coming to the contemporary moment, the trust, for example, has child psychiatrists, mental health professionals as well as doctors who are part of the trust. So I think Sanjeev is not here, who's the secretary. His imagination getting in people on the trust was to how do you ensure that you're not a family-run trust, That can often be very insular, very inward-looking, as it were. You have to have the best people in the city as well who are part of the trust. And so that's the imagination underlying the trust as of now. And maybe a couple of points I'll make on the trust as of now, and then I'll just try and move from that thematic. Even now, we had the Independence Day celebration recently, for which the former the Advocate General of Karnataka, Mr. Ravi Kumar, came and spoke. And we were telling him about the children who were here in school, right? And the children who are part of this school. And the children who are in the school, there are more Dalit children, minority children in this school than most government schools. So his point is you really are catering to the children in the very bottom of the socioeconomic spectrum as far as the school is concerned. And again, all credit to Sanjeev and his imagination. He's had the imagination to try and restore this area where you're sitting now. This area has been restored recently. The rooms inside function as a kind of an art space for the children. So there's an art space which is taken very seriously. There's the sports complex as well. If you see the football academy and the cricket academy, that's something which the RBANM kids can participate in, and the top level facilities which these kids can completely utilize. So there's a way in which we are trying to take the imagination forward of the school as it was established, and seeing what we can do for kids who otherwise might not have many opportunities as far as life itself is concerned. Perhaps the one point I want to make, getting into the Constitution again, is the idea, the mission and the vision, if you want to put it in a broad sense, is how can education develop the child's capacities to the best extent possible? And second, equally importantly, how can the child end up contributing to the broader principle of equality and solidarity and fraternity, right? How can the child end up being a part of the wider world that we live in and contribute to change the world that we live in? Those will be the broad aspirations or imperatives driving the educational imperative, educational efforts as far as the RBNMS area is concerned. Maybe on the charitable question, since the charitable question was the one which I promised to say something about, the point to make perhaps is that it's very important to think of charity as a way of, of self. I think even the question of the self itself, as going back to the entire question of fraternity and the entire question of, of self-development, it's very important to have giving as a part of who you are, right? And so that's a tradition which we really need to continue. I'll make two last comments and then I'll end with that, and maybe we can have a discussion. Is the couple of other institutions which I've been a part of, which I want to just briefly highlight, very, very briefly. One is, of course, the Alternative Law Forum, which is the lawyering forum based again on Infantry Road. And the idea there is it's not so much the education dimension in and of itself, but how can you actually work at transforming or changing the world through using law as a tool or a mechanism? That's one kind of a framework. And the other framework is the People's Union of Civil Liberties, also which I'm associated with, where the idea is how do you try and contribute to the human rights issue at a national level? How do you think of change? How do you think of, in a sense, taking forward, again, going back to the Constitution, the ideas of liberty, equality, fraternity, and dignity in the broadest possible way? I think I'll end with that, since I think I've said a lot as of now, and perhaps any discussion we can have a conversation on these issues. Yeah. Karishma is asking me about this book which I did called India's Undeclared Emergency, Constitutionalism and the Politics of Resistance. And the book itself looks at a comparison between the emergency period 1975 to 77 and the contemporary era, which is 2014 onwards, which I've been characterizing, which has been characterized as the undeclared emergency. And the question which we're trying to raise in the context of the question I was trying to raise in the context of the book is what are the similarities between then and now? What are the differences between then and now? And what can you do in the context of today? The similarities we can see in terms of an authoritarian state, similarities we can see in terms of the arrest of a range of people who are artists or writers or intellectuals or human rights activists or lawyers who are in jail today and who are in jail at that particular moment in time. Similarities in terms of the use of the Maintenance of Internal Security Act, today the use of Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. Similarities in terms of the psychological state which you call fear. That is, the imperative of the emergency, again, was to impose upon you a certain sense of fear, a certain chilling of your public expression, a certain way in which you felt scared to say anything because you could be picked up or arrested, as it were. And there's a similar sense of fear which one sees. I mean, of course, you don't see the fear, and we're happily talking to you guys now. Similar sense of fear which you see in the post-2014 period, which I think to some extent has lifted post the elections of 2024, right? So there's a way in which there's a greater, I think, openness of conversation and dialogue and debate post the elections of 2024. So I think trying it back to the thematic of totalitarianism or a rising totalitarianism or an emerging totalitarianism, the key dimension on all of us is how do you cultivate a certain kind of a politics of hope? how do you work with each other and to try and cultivate a certain way of resisting what is oppressive, what is totalitarian, and how do you create a certain space for conversations such as this? So that's the imperative of the book, in a broad sense, and indicating both the challenges which are there, and in a sense trying to say that there's things we can do to challenge the current status quo.
How or what is it that we can do to get people to trust that this is India? Because there are many narratives that are being uh, put out by political parties today to claim that this is their interpretation of the constitution, or which seems far removed from what the freedom fighters and the makers of the constitution wanted. So do you think that do you call it trust, or what do you call it? How to get, or do you say belief in the constitution, or or love? yeah, love as well. So because we're talking about trust today, so I want to come back to that word and say, how do you get people to trust that this is our India, this is the country that we were handed over?
When you think of the Constitution as a document, you can think of it as some ways, it's a legal document. So where's the question of love or trust of a legal document? How can a document which is words inspire that love or that trust as you're framing it? And I think there the question of history becomes important, and trying to understand the spirit which underlies the Constitution. What are the ideals which underlie each of the words of the Constitution? And that's what I think can indicate or can cultivate that spirit of either love or trust towards the Constitution. Perhaps maybe you think of a couple of examples on this point, right? And if you think of the word dignity, which is there in the preamble to the Indian Constitution, we know that it was now not then the objectives resolution, it becomes a part of the preamble. And if you go back to the drafting history, you realize it comes in because Ambedkar was very keen that the word dignity be there. And then you go back to Ambedkar's life history and you get a sense of, the experience of humiliation. Again, thinking of schools, if you go back to his essay, Waiting for a Visa, the really powerful and very moving description of how when he went to school, he had to go carrying a gunny sack, sit on that sack, and come back. And if he wanted to drink water, he had to cup his hands, and the peon would open the tap and drink the water and come back. And as he puts it, if sometimes you wanted water, and the peon was not there, no peon, no water. So there's a way in which the experience of humiliation was his experience of the past. So the Constitution symbolizes a dawn of the idea of dignity, where you are equal regardless of the fact of the caste that you come from. So that's a story which gives a certain kind of a lifeblood to the otherwise dry document called the Constitution. And perhaps one more story one can think of when we're talking about the question of fearlessness is Mahatma Gandhi at the entire sedition trial again, where Gandhiji is tried for the offense of sedition. Sedition is defined in the law as exciting disaffection against the government established by law. And in the sedition speech, he advocates the idea that the sedition law is something which should not be there, because the way he puts it, the sedition law is the prince among the political provisions of the Indian Penal Code designed to suppress the liberty of the individual. So again, you get a deep sense of commitment to the idea of freedom of thought and the freedom of expression and the liberty to express one's thinking and develop one's thinking, as it were. So I think there's a way in which you can go back to the Constitution as an instrument or as a document which embodies the hopes and the aspirations and the histories of people, both against a form of colonial domination as well as against a form of internal domination, be it on grounds of caste or gender or sexuality, right? So there's a way in which the Constitution can inspire the deepest love, I'd use the word love, based on, the fact that the ideals that it stands for and the fact that these ideas are something we want to take forward in the time going forward.
The key word, equality, do you think in the current context, if it is sort of replaced with equity, would there be still say, debacle around reservations and other much needed, I say, like political context?
Yeah, see the equity question. You can also look at it with the notions of equality itself as both what you call formal equality and substantive equality. So the Indian Constitution, for example, has both the notions of formal equality and substantive equality. Formal equality would be, say, Article 14, which will say that, you treat like people in the same category should be treated in a similar fashion. But Article 15.4, 16.4 will make the point that the Constitution guarantees a reservation for those who are historically subordinated or discriminated. So that's what you'd broadly describe as the notion of equity, which is there in the Constitution. So the Indian Constitution is, again, in a broad sense, again, there's a judgment of Krishna here where he makes the point, is not something which merely prohibits both the rich and the poor alike from sleeping under the same bridge, but the way in which it tries to make provision for those who are at the very bottom of the socio-economic hierarchy by putting forward a scheme, what you call compensatory discrimination, for those who have suffered injustices in the past. So it's not a document of formal equality alone, but really a document based on substantive equality.
So we are a federal structure, right? But whenever it comes to upholding the trust, and particularly when we talk about undeclared emergencies since 2014, it gives a flavor that the responsibility of upholding the trust lies with the union government. But don't you think that any elected government, which includes the state government as well, in the federal structure, has an equal responsibility of upholding the trust? And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I come from West Bengal, one of the most politically charged, politically active state. I've been in active student politics for a very, very long time. I was a communist in communist politics at the very forefront. So I've seen much before 2014 how the state has suppressed, the voices. It could be one political party there, another political party here. But this mechanism have always been there. So I slightly disagree that this entire undeclared emergency started in 2014. I would say it probably was there much, much, much before. Probably it never went away in the first place. That's my personal view. You can feel free to disagree.
I think that's a great question. What is it about the contemporary 2014 onwards that makes it so unique or so different from any episode in the past? You're right. Lots of people have made the point that when you're referring to the question of authoritarianism, it's perhaps embedded in the structure of the Indian Constitution as well. When you look at Article 22, which recognizes, which allows for preventive detention, one can argue that there's a certain way in which the structure of the Indian state has always had an authoritarian dimension to it. I think that I wouldn't really disagree with you on that point. And the 75 to 77 in 2014 onwards is a form of intensification of that trend of the question of the authoritarianism of the state. Again, what is different about 75 to 77 to what are the episodes you're describing is during the emergency, that right to association or the right to assembly completely go away. In other periods in time, even however difficult the time period has been, we've always had the ability to speak out or to organize or to mobilize against those instances, however bad they have been. But the 75 to 77, if you read the Shah Commission, etc., you get a sense that it's impossible for you to do anything at all. And the contemporary moment, I think the additional dimension which we'll have to add to this is the idea that the authoritarianism of the state is supplemented by certain kind of authoritarianism in society itself. When you talk about the vigilante crimes against by vigilante elements, which would be the demolition of homes of minorities, or be it the killing of minorities on the streets by vigilante forces. That's an additional dimension to the authoritarianism of the past. That's why I think the Arendt framework is the idea of thinking of it as totalitarianism, not necessarily authoritarianism alone, or what different people have called different languages. But you want to indicate that there's certain kind of a mobilizing of society itself in this current dimension through vigilante forces or vigilante elements. So there's a way in which the current moment has elements which are more dangerous, I think, than the elements of the past, be it the 75 to 77, or be it the earlier periods that you get that you're referring to. Again, I think the point has to be clear that you can't obviously take the line that any period in Indian history has been free from the question of human rights abuses or violations. We've always had that problem. I think I'm completely with you on that point. But 75 to 77 is an intensification of that trend, and 2014 onwards is an intensification of that trend with a certain kind of a additional dimension, which is, I think, the entire question of the Hindutva dimension, which is very powerful and very strong today, where you're talking about replacing or supplanting a certain structure where you believe in the equality of all persons with another kind of normative framework itself. So there's a deeper danger, I think, to the 2014 post 2014 period as compared to even the 75 to 77 or the early periods that you're referencing. But again, the point being very clear, these are points of discussion and debate. I don't think it's an answer one way or the other.
Hi, I wanted to know a little bit more on alternate law forum that you kind of is a founder member of, mainly because why is it called alternate law forum? And going by the name of it, I'm assuming that it's more of self-initiated cases that you would deal with. So what's the kind of approach?
Why did we call ourselves the alternative law forum? I think there are two ways to answer that. One is the idea that sometimes within the law, people think that the law is the answer to everything. The alternative law forum, we think of the idea of there are also alternatives to law. So think of the law in coordination with social movements and social struggles, as it were. And if you take the case again, the example which we have, maybe I'll give this one example which may clarify that point a little bit, is we looked at the battle for LGBTQ rights in the Indian context in terms of the fight against Section 377. It was a fight which we fought over 17 years. And we saw it as a socio-legal battle. That is, the law is one thing, but we don't see the change in the law as a good in and of itself. The change in the law is also about changing the mindsets of the way society thinks. That's absolutely critical and vital. When discrimination is in the social sphere, discrimination is in the everyday sphere, in the family sphere, etc., you can't say we'll get rid of a law and the world will change. The world will change only if you think of the two as coming together. So you must have in your mind, you must have an idea that there are also alternatives to the law in terms of thinking about transformation and change. And if you think of the current marriage judgment, marriage decision, and perhaps that is a criticism one can put forward on that dimension, where the battle was over 4 years or 3 years, and we didn't have a strong enough social dimension or a political dimension. We only had a legal dimension. So you must be able to think of the legal and the social and the political coming together, and that's one part of the imagination of the alternative law forum. The second part is when we say alternative, we think of the law. The law has a very close and intimate relationship with capital, and that's quite clear. You see the question of the development of the law itself. Look at the Juvenile Justice Act. You look at the Supreme Court interpretation on it. There's not that much on it. Look at the Income Tax Act. It's almost every comma and every full stop there'll be an interpretation of, right? So the law and capital have a very close relationship. And so our point is, how do you build a relationship with the areas of the law which has not been such a close or intimate connection or relationship with? How do you look at the law? How do you look at, for example, the law with respect to slum dwellers, the law with respect to street vendors? How do you look at the other legislations and look at the other laws and what contribution they can make in terms of the entire question of social transformation?
I was hoping you could speak a little more about your great-great-granduncle's just a certain worldview of Arvind Narrain Swami Mudaliar. Because I think with a lot of what you've said, if you're looking at the grand arc of social transformation, I'm thinking that there are different dimensions of it, and each steps in at different times. So say, for example, when you mentioned the People's Union for Civil Liberties, that strategy is about a strategy of, resisting status quo in a certain way. To be able to say, okay, this will not do. We need to change it. When you speak of the alternative law forum, that strategy is more a kind of a directing change where you say, there are lawyers who are using the court system, who are in some who can speak a certain language, who push for a certain kind of a change. And then you have, a way of co-creating change. Like, say, for example, with the trust, for example, the kinds of people on the trust, it's not only people who have a certain radical point of view, but rather you may have someone like the Divan of Mysore who's also on the trust. I mean, people who hold a certain kind of power and status, who also come together, but who also have a vision of what a school for Dalit children would actually look like, or school for young women. And then you have, so that's the co-creating change. And then you have this thing about imagining change. So that's Narayan Swami Mudaliar's idea of imagining what a future can be. So you already build alternatives in anticipation of what is to come, in preparation of what is to come. So, and all of these things interact with each other in terms of how change actually happens. There's no one way something like this happens. So when you're looking at the legacy of Narayan Swami Mudaliar, because I kind of seem to think that his approach to change seems to have been one of imagining an alternative, imagining change of what could be, and already planting seeds for that. And the other is co-creating change to the extent of bringing in, to some extent, the right kind of citizenry to be able to say, okay, we all have different points of view, but we could come together to do something like this. So where I'm going at with this is that to talk a little more about that particular approach to change, and does that legacy continue with how RBANM is today? Do you still occupy that piece of the change strategy, and where do you see it going from here?
Arvind Swami Mudaliar, and as I indicated, he passed away in 1910, and Gandhi landed in India in 1914. Right, so it's a literally for all of us, it's a time before time. So I think the idea of presuming, right, you had this imperative or the imagination that even before the Indian National Congress was formed, that India must be free. If you had that imagination, what would you do? The only thing you can do is, as you indicate, is create that space where the ideas can grow and the ideas can flourish. Where through education, more people can start thinking on these lines, as it were. So there's a way in which history can also limit you, can also maybe increase the possibilities of what can happen. And I keep thinking that at that moment in time, he did what was possible within that time frame. If you imagine the same charitable institution established in independent India, how would the imagination have been different? Would have thought very differently about what freedom should be, or what the ideals one should subserve. And was it again a question again? I think the imagination point is actually very important. I think in the context of Narayan Swami Mudaliar, because you'll see this was the boys' school. Next to that now is the girls' school, and in between the girls' school and this is what is the Brahmo Samaj, right? And what is the connection of the Brahmo Samaj to these institutions? Again, very interestingly, when you made me remember that point, is the first principal. I forgot to mention the first principal of the school was Bipin Chandra Pal. Right? And how did Bipin Chandra Pal from Calcutta or Bengal land up here to be the headmaster of a school in Bangalore? And again, the archival information document seems to indicate Narayan Swami Mudaliar was in touch with someone, some authority, I forget the name of the authority, British authority. And the British authority said, there's a young, I'll put the word on the Brahmo Samaj, and maybe one of the young men from there can come and teach her. And so one of the young men from there who came was Bipin Chandra Pal. And the young man came also because the young man at the time was very interested in the ideals of the Brahmo Samaj. And he was told that, you come here, you be the headmaster. In the evening, you propagate the ideas of the Brahmo Samaj. So he'd teach here, and then he'd go to the Brahmo Samaj and he'd propagate, he'd take forward the ideals of the Brahmo Samaj over there. And again, the archival documentation indicates that he was a very popular speaker, Bipin Chandra Pal, when he spoke in the Brahmo Samaj over here. And go back to the Brahmo Samaj again. Brahmo Samaj was again, in your words, was imagining an India which is not there, was going back to a certain kind of ideals of basic equality, a certain kind of freedom from the caste system, a certain kind of liberalism of the mind was what the Brahmo Samaj was based on. And those are the ideals which obviously motivated Narayan Swami Mudaliar, because he got in Bipin Chandra Pal over here, And the Brahmo Samaj is in that sense it's not a sister institution, but it's next next to RBANM, and I think the philosophy flowed through. Obviously, his way of thinking, right? Where did he get the idea that the caste system is wrong, or it's something which should go, or we should challenge it? I think he got it from these liberal currents, which were there in a time before independence, but are there in terms of that creating that possibility of change. Bipin Chandra Pal and the Brahma Samaj creating the possibility of change, and he was a part of that. He had those connections, and making those connections in terms of thinking of a future which is based on the equality of both women and equality of all persons, regardless of caste.
This question has always bothered me, the idea of what philanthropy means today. And is there a right way of getting involved? Because in practice, it could mean a lot of things. On the one hand, you're making money, and on the other, you're giving it away. But if you look at someone like Mr. Mudliar himself, he was a businessman too, but here we are. I always feel like we constrain ourselves with this idea of, I can't be a corporate and at the same time give money away to a charitable cause. But what do you think? Is there a right way of doing philanthropy, living it in practicality? Can you lead two lives? That we always live a lot of contradictions.
I think that's in a sense Sanjay's question as well, right? Where the point that he was asking is that sometimes you're doing something which is in the immediate moment. Like, for example, the PUCL or the ALF is in the immediate moment. It's about now, right? The state is doing something awful, you need to respond to it. State arresting A, B, or C, you need to respond to it, you're responding to it now. And that's your imperative, as it were. But the question is there also ways of allowing for the imagination of a future through other means, as it were. And in the long duration of history, these are very important points, and for people to have that imagination to say, hey, perhaps I can't be at this moment a part of an activist setup, an activist network. I can't be, but my role is just in terms of nurturing this thinking in the generations to come. And so that's the role I want to play, right? And so that's a way of thinking also of co-creating change, or the idea of thinking of change for the future. So I would think that there's a lot that charitable institutions or charities can do, and the different parts of a puzzle, all of which add up in some fashion or the other. Assuming that all you're doing in your institution is creating a space for critical thought. You have no idea what's going to happen. You have no idea what your students are going to do. You have no idea where they're going to go. But just create that space. Who knows? Out of the institution might come people who might end up challenging in a fundamental way the current status quo and creating or allowing for the creation of a new world, as it were. So I think that everything can contribute. So it's really up to people to figure out what is the way that they want to contribute to this larger process of transformation. That being said, I think it's also important to support institutions which are on the front lines as well. And it's not easy, but we have to figure out a way of doing that support as well.
I want to go back to something you started with, right? This idea of isolationism. And I was just thinking, we've all, something we don't talk about, and maybe social psychologists will say we don't talk about it because we're still traumatized by it. The idea of the pandemic and what happened to all of us, right? So everybody who's around has a very vivid memory of being isolated, right? And as you said, I think it's nice. I was also thinking Sunday morning, I'm going to go and listen to Arvind speak about this. Who else will show up, right? And why are they showing up, right? In a way, I could have just had a lazy Sunday morning, but I guess the reason I'm here is to try and find out how we can connect and think of the problems that we have, right? So, I mean, what's inspiring, as you said, is we're in the premises of someone who, in his time, was thinking about the world he's living in. And as you said, he's a very successful entrepreneur. We are, living in a time when we are watching a wedding of another very successful entrepreneur, and I'm told that the Reliance Foundation also does things. Right? So there's been a little talk about mass weddings they've held and what they contribute to. I would want to be less cynical and want to know what else they're doing. And perhaps, unfortunately, the way things are, we make jokes about the wedding or whatever, but hopefully there are things that they're also doing. Right? So there's a way in which as you said, everybody in wherever they are trying to do things. I think most of us who've showed up today are trying to fight that sense of isolationism and trying to connect, to just have a conversation perhaps, right? In terms of, you've given us a sense of history of a particular individual who did his bit. But as we are all here now and we are trying to fight off isolationism and try to connect, and thinking of these issues, I mean, you've talked about the Constitution, I think Vinay talked about that period. So you go back from, you started with the 1810s, 1840s. We lead up to the early 20th century, in the middle of the 20th century. But as we think about what we can do as individuals now in the time that we live in, responding to the challenges that we have, right? Deep inequality, climate crisis. I mean, you've told us about your involvement with ALF and PUCL. But I'm also thinking education, I think, is a very important context, right? And you think of young people now in the country that we are living in, and we see this around us now, whether it's because of technology. I actually think the pandemic has a lot to do with it. I mean, we teach in a university where so tomorrow afternoon I'll go back to a class of 18 to 20-year-olds, and I'm really struggling to connect with them to try and understand how are they seeing the world that we are living in, right? And why are they grappling with connecting with each other as well as with other things. And as I said, my own senses and just connecting to why are young people struggling so much is, I think, the long shadow of the pandemic, where we all really experienced isolation of a different level than anything that we've experienced earlier, right? So I'm just giving you my quick sense of that. But since you started with isolationism, which is not something we think of when we think of trust, but clearly that's a real problem, right? We are all grappling with our own sense of loneliness that inhibits us from connecting, even with like-minded people, and not necessarily like-minded people. It's also connecting with people perhaps we disagree with, and we fundamentally think they have a different worldview. But there is a way in which we are not making that connection, right? And I think that's a real challenge of our time. I know you've thought about it in the last chapter of your book. You talk about humor, right? And of course, we all turn to humor. If there's something on my YouTube feed I'm turning to, it's something that will make me laugh. That's the first thing. I don't want to be more cynical and go to something which will be, creating despair in some ways. Yeah? But you've thought about this issue, so I wonder, since you diagnosed the problem of loneliness and lack of connectivity, what are you thinking about that, especially with you also dealing with young people and they come to you to sort of ask for a way forward? What do you think the current challenge of that in our time is? And
I would raise the loneliness question a little before the pandemic. Pandemic may accentuate at that particular moment in time, but I think the technology question was also central to the loneliness point. I think as in fact, I think you were telling me that students nowadays, in our time, perhaps in the law school, you'd go out and be having a sort of coffee and chatting around butteries or whatever it might be. But now the students sometimes go back to their own rooms and watch Netflix on their own. So that sense of a community of the group is really not there. Technology ends up isolating you from your own people around you. So technology and loneliness might be one kind of a dimension. And in fact, I mean, I was just reading that the UK has diagnosed this problem to the extent that they have a minister for loneliness. Yeah, cabinet minister for loneliness. So they take it very seriously as like something which creates a huge problem. But in India, again, right, the range of people doing a range of things. I had this opportunity to go to another organization called Samvada, which we have been associated with for many years. They established something called the Baduku Community College. And they called me to come and speak on a Sunday on a hardcore legal topic, Keshavananda Bharati judgment, right? And I was doing that for students who were mainly Kannada speaking from around Karnataka. And they were taking the effort of traveling from around Karnataka and coming for the weekend to the space to listen to or to educate themselves on dimensions of the law, right? So the point over here is, I think the range of people working on this right to association or forming associations, which is the one way in which you combat loneliness. Again, if you go back to Tocqueville's Democracy in America, he begins with that point. He says the America is a deeply isolating country. It produces a sense of loneliness. Everybody is concerned with their own individual well-being, etc. But the one thing which can save America is the right to association, or the associations you form, be it community associations, social associations, whatever it may be. So I think in a similar sense, I guess if you ask the question, how do you combat loneliness? I think there's only one answer. You have to exercise your right to association and and form path associations, because it's both important for your individual well-being as well as for the larger collective well-being. So that's the heart of what we need to do, I think, in the time going forward. And that's something we can still do. I don't think that path is ruled out. Nobody's preventing us in forming or being a part of associations which help reduce the sense of loneliness, as it were.
3 things I have seen people do well when it comes to addressing loneliness. One is reconnecting with themselves really well. So it could look like a detox technology. It could look like, a bit of solo travel, a bit of rediscovering themselves, ensuring healthy habits, rituals, whatever that is. 2, I have seen people do the same things that they would otherwise do alone, but do it in a more community setting. So watching a movie alone, no. Do it as part of a movie club. Reading a book alone, no. Go to Cubbon Reads on a Saturday morning, silent book reading community, do it with other people. Things like those. And third, something I've seen work really well is just knowing that we are relational beings and shutting off your screens when you are in public. So not going back to your phones or your AirPods or like whatever that is to act busy, but being open to the idea of just smiling and making eye contact and saying a hi or how's your day going, or being a regular at a place so that you're known outside your work by your name. So there's a regular cafe, and I understand not as many people are like pro-religion or whatever that is, but there were certain things that religion was serving by the virtue of going to a church every Sunday, by the virtue of showing up in a community every time. So whatever those alternatives or substitutes or replacements are that would still get you the same benefits, I think those are important. So maybe now it looks like being a regular at a third wave coffee roasters, if not a temple, or being a regular at a salsa class, if not something else. But yeah, just like being consistent and showing up, it's like truly important. So
I think the Arendt framework is, she talks about loneliness, isolation, and solitude. She says, I mean, the imperative is how do you combat loneliness and isolation and cultivate solitude. What you indicated also, it's okay to be on your own. That's not the problem. But how do you connect to yourself? And that's the question which perhaps literature can help, perhaps reading can help, perhaps music can help, perhaps the range of ways in which you can connect to yourself at a deeper level. That being said, I think loneliness is a problem, but also we have to think of the entire question of, the largest of happiness, which is linked to not just the question of me fighting my own loneliness. It's also linked to the question of me contributing to the larger notion of public happiness. So there's a way in which public spirited work should be a part of your attempt to combat loneliness as well. Yeah.
I want to take you back to the topic where we were talking about authoritarian state, totalitarian state. And we have been talking about history, and 2014 onwards, we have seen changes. 2024, you mentioned that there was something that happened better in elections, right? I want to know your viewpoint on BNS, implementation of BNS. BNS is it taking us to more authoritarian state, or where are we moving with that?
BNS is the new criminal laws which have come into force in India since this month, the beginning of this month. And the PUCL had a report on that which said that converting a de facto police regime into a de jure police state. And that was the analysis of the new criminal laws. For two or three particular reasons, I'll just mention that so you get a sense of what is referring to in the new criminal laws. One is, under the old criminal laws, the Criminal Procedure Code, the maximum period of police custody was 15 days. The new laws, it allows for 15 days, spread over a period of 90 days or 60 days. So the cops could take you in for 3 days, send you back to judicial custody. take you back for another 5 days. So they could keep doing that up and down for almost 90 days. So there's a certain way in which that sanctity of 15 days goes. But the other very, very important point is that the way in which you can read the change in the law to imply that now police custody can be up to 60 days or 90 days. So if that interpretation holds, of course, the Home Minister says, oh, no, it's only 15 days. But the law can be interpreted to mean 60 days or 90 days. Police custody of 60 days or 90 days, if that's not a police state, I don't know what is, 60 days of police custody, where most countries, they reduce the period of police custody. Whereas we have, in this interpretation, may have even increased the period of police custody. That's one point. And the second is the law on sedition. I mean, I referenced Gandhi in the sedition trial, right? And sedition in the old law was exciting disaffection against the government established by law, which was considered vague, which is vague. The language was vague. But now the law has been much broader. It includes, for example, inciting apprehensions of subversion. I think the language is inciting thoughts of subversion. I mean, how can I be criminalized for inciting thoughts in you of subversion? However broadly that is defined. So there's ways in which the current law is even broader, in terms of what it criminalizes under the government's ability to literally pretend that this is all for the better, while doing the exact opposite is really unmatched. No? They made the entire point that we're moving away from the colonial regime, but they put in place even a stronger colonial regime, because the degree of control you now have over the individual is far more in the current legal regime than in the previous legal regime. So in short, the current criminal laws are moving us towards a police state. I'm firmly of that opinion.
With respect to freedom of expression, especially for human rights activists, writers, and who are just sent to jail without much understanding of what really happened, and under false cases under the UAPA Act. And that creates a sense of fear and lack of trust in the entire public system, the government system, or even law, because it takes so long to get like a supporting case for who are really fighting for freedom or other causes. So from the lens of fraternity or community, how do we as the common man help, not help, but actually advocate rather than protests or resistance? That protests and resistance are there, and there are people doing it, and you have to put in a lot of effort to get people together to do that. But other than that, what are other ways in which we can help or we can contribute to one, getting the people who are wronged justice; second, stopping these things from increasing furthermore, or like getting worse even more than what has happened in the past 10 years or so, or what would keep happening. I ask this because irrespective of what happens, the majority of the people who question the people in power are from marginalized communities, and irrespective of whatever, they are the ones who get discriminated or harassed the most in any system. So then for raising those voices, there is a bigger fear on how do you do it. And adding to that, there is also the aspect of media. Media is so controlled that you only get to see what the authorities would like you to see, and then there is no way to go. Like now, YouTube, Instagram, everybody would every now and then cancel someone's account on freedom of speech, saying that, okay, you're saying anti-national things, and the entire operation of speech and all of that. So how does a common person try to figure out, okay, how do I contribute to this thing? How do I help with the aspect of justice to whosoever is there from the very limited power that we have?
The starting point for people who feel a certain way and who think that this is wrong and find it difficult to do something about it is because they feel that they're alone. So how do you in essence start beginning that process of cultivating that sense of a community of people who think similarly? I think that would really be the starting point. You have to find that space within yourself to say that, I'm not afraid, right? And that's not an easy space to come to. It's not all, you may never get to that space, but you start that process of building that space. And I always believe that courage is not always an individual thing. Sometimes it's a collective thing. I mean, courage comes just from being in the middle of other people. It's not necessarily that you are necessarily the greatly courageous person, not always, but sometimes it just happens. But connecting with other people, that sense of that fear goes away, right? And again, this is the point which I love sharing, is in the discovery of India, there was a really beautiful section on what he thinks is Gandhi's most important contribution to the freedom movement. And this is what he taught us, above all, is be not afraid. The colonial state, with its army, its police, imposes the sense of fear upon you, that fear of doing anything and you could get arrested and picked up. So Gandhi's greatest contribution, he taught us, do not be afraid, right? So how do we cultivate that sense of not being afraid, right? And then once you're not afraid, then a range of things, I think, become possible. Again, right, I think I'm not going to say do this or do that, but I'm saying that it's about finding that mental space within yourself where you feel you can do what you think is right and be not afraid of the consequences. So that's the space I think each one has to try and get to, not on their own, but in community and with other people.
Sir, I would just like to say thanks from on behalf of the audience, of course, but also I think for us at Creative Mornings, there is a greater sense of responsibility with what we're running, and that really happened today after hearing you speak about what forums like these contribute to. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.